Hi, I'm Josh, and with my terrible run of fantasy books over the past couple of years, I decided to come back to an author who I know I can count on to write some of the very best fantasy novels of all time, as well as some good but not amazing fantasy books, and at least one really quite terrible fantasy book. But I know at least the guy can write, and this is Guy Gavriel Kay and A Song for Arbonne, a book that I wanted to pick up because, like I said, I haven't had the greatest experience with fantasy in general over the past couple of years. And this one, yeah, well, we'll get into it, but it follows Guy Kay's most common formula, which is that he takes historical fiction. I don't know if it was Guy Kay himself or somebody else who described a lot of his books as historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastic, or in other words, primarily historical fiction, but with a tiny bit of fantasy sprinkled in there. And so what Guy Kay often likes to do with his books is take a real world historical setting, real nations, real historical people, real religions, and then just kind of change them all a little bit and sprinkle in his little bit of fantasy there and make it his own world, which honestly I find pretty irritating. I just wish he would keep the real world names of things in place, because I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, I need to, in my own head, be constantly making the comparisons. Okay, the Jadites are the Christians, the Kindath are the Jews, the Asherites are the Muslims, this nation is Italy, this one is Spain, this character is Justinian I, and I can't help but bring the real world history that the book is based on into play and trying to constantly make that association. I know why Guy Kay doesn't do that. I know why he has changed the names of everything, because he wants the freedom to keep in what real world events that he wants to keep in, but he also wants to be able to play fast and loose with that history and make whatever changes he wants to make without feeling compelled to stay true to the actual history. So that's why he brings it into his own world. He does his own thing with it, and it makes sense, but I find it slightly annoying. So in this case, yeah, we definitely have a situation where the nations of the book are clearly representing Western European nations. I think Arbonne is maybe supposed to be Spain. I'm gonna have to maybe look up Wikipedia to see if I got that right, but there are several nations here that are interacting with each other that certainly appear to be medieval Western European type situations going on. In terms of a very brief plot summary without spoiling anything, our first point of view character here, this red-bearded fellow, is a warrior, seems to be roughly a middle-aged warrior who has found himself in a strange land. He has left his home nation, come to this nation of Arbonne, which is one that he sees as being different from his own, in that Arbonne very much values singers, artists, song, and the things of beauty in life over the more manly pursuits of combat and warfare and all that sort of stuff that our fellow here is used to. And so he's in a strange nation. He appears to maybe be running away from something in his past. At first, we're not quite sure what's going on there, but ultimately he does end up getting kind of sucked into the bigger events of the world. These nations start to come in conflict with each other. There's a war that breaks out, and more this fellow is drawn into the events that are happening around him. And so we get a situation that starts off as a very small personal story that grows and expands into this multinational event and so forth. So that's, the general idea of where this book is headed without spoiling anything about the actual story. Now, from a writing perspective, obviously Guy Kay can write, although it's not without its flaws. So I'm going to dive in some depth into the writing here. I would highly suggest you skip this section unless you yourself are a writer or an aspiring writer, because I'm going to get into some nitpicky stuff here, and the more you learn about the technical aspects of writing, the more you can really ruin yourself on enjoying good stories, because then you become focused on how the story is written instead of what's actually happening in the book. But for those of you who have an interest, let's get into the writing. Guy Kay's writing style feels a little bit like old-fashioned fantasy, and that it is slightly melodramatic, although oftentimes it's beautifully done. So we have this very nice, eloquent, descriptive prose that, like I said, gets a little bit much at times, but overall it is a really nice writing style. Now, the way the story is presented is we have the action of the story taking place, and there's a huge backstory to all the political machinations and all the big events of the world, and this is filled out through the perspective of characters pausing to think about the past. So it feels like roughly 2/3 of the book is a character right in the middle of some big action scene, just pausing to think about all the events that led up to this particular thing happening. And so we'll get sometimes even several pages of a character flashing back to events of the past to fill in that backstory, and then we'll get back to the action again, and the characters will go about their business, and then we'll get into another action scene, and then the character will pause again to think about the past and all the various things that have woven together to end up in this particular point in time. It's a little bit irritating. Like, on the one hand, Kay does weave together this really rich, detailed history of these nations. On the other hand, it really distracts a lot from the events of the story itself that we're really interested in. So there's a little bit of give and take with that. In terms of getting into the nitpickiness of the writing itself, I'm going to get into some similes that made me kind of go, what does that mean? And then one that I really quite liked as a contrast here. So starting with a couple that made me question what I was reading, we have, "It was a lovely night, clear as a shepherd's dream." How clear are shepherd's dreams? I don't know. And then there's this one. "In the next heartbeat, he realized, with a feeling akin to that which sometimes came when the white moon broke free of clouds to shine serenely down upon the earth where men and women lived and died, that he could deal with that desire. He was not a slave to it." That's the craziest simile I've ever read, potentially. But here's one that I thought was done very nicely that made more sense to me. "Her mother had understood, surprisingly. Signe, beautiful and glittering like an ornamental jewel under torchlight in Barbantine, seemed nonetheless to have understood a great deal always." That's a much more clear and beautifully presented simile, I think. Like an ornamental jewel under torchlight in Barbantine. Moving on to sort of a trope that I get really sick of reading, and to be fair, this book was published back in 1992, so maybe it wasn't used as much, but here's a couple of quick quotes. We have, "Glancing up, she saw Duke Bertrand walking over, a thin smile playing about his lips. It didn't reach his eyes, though." And then later, "She was smiling, but not with her eyes." And then later, "The King of Gorholt, past the first surprise of this, was smiling, only with his lips, though. His eyes were hard as stone." And I get so sick and tired of hearing authors use this phrase, "He was smiling, but not with his eyes." A good author can come up with so many different ways to describe that. Like, he smirked, or he sneered, or he grimaced, or he smiled, but it was a smile that made him feel cold. Or you don't have to keep using that same tired phrase of "he smiled, but not with his eyes." It's somewhat similarly to that. One thing that also irritates me that I see a lot in the fantasy fiction I read anyways is the ability of characters to read the most detailed and subtle ideas out of the tiniest expressions, or even just by looking into a character's eyes, they can tell exactly what's going on with that character. And well, I do recognize that nonverbal communication is a huge part of communication. I mean, just try using subtle humor on the internet. Typically when I've tried to do that, it has failed fairly miserably. So yes, nonverbal communication is a very important part of communicating with other people. However, just this amount of detail is being read into these small things, and I'll give you the examples so you can see what I'm talking about. The first 5 examples here are taking place over the course of 6 pages in this book, so you'll see what I mean. One character is looking into another character's eyes, and it says, "There was a look of anticipation and of something else now, a kind of youthful, infectious delight in the blue eyes of the Duke." And a character is looking into another character's eyes, and they are recognizing anticipation and a kind of youthful, infectious delight just by looking in his eyes. Later, on the very same page, "There was a flicker of amusement in his eyes," Blaise saw. What does a flicker of amusement in someone's eyes look like? I'm not sure. 2 pages later, "Sad tidings," said Bertrand de Tolaire, his equanimity regained. Blaise recognized the tone and the glint in his eyes. What exactly is a glint in an eye? Like, am I glinting? Just a few paragraphs later, "I am sadly between contracts at the moment," he said calmly, and Blaise saw Bertrand and Valerie both take the point. How did you see 2 people take the point at the same time? The very next page, check this paragraph out. "Looking at his friend, at the clever, handsome face, Blaise knew with certainty that this was at least part of the truth, possibly even the largest part. He saw that Bertrand realized it too. The Duke's own amusement was obvious. He shook his head and looked over at Valerie. His cousin's expression was wry." All these characters are looking at each other, reading the most subtle things into their body language, I guess, which I don't know how that exactly is done. A bit later now, he turned to Rudel again and saw wry admiration in his friend's eyes as he looked towards the unassuming Chancellor of Arbonne. 5 pages after that, he paused. Her blue gaze was intently searching his eyes. "I am not one of them, Your Grace, not any longer." He thought he saw a flicker of understanding and then sorrow chasing it away. What? He saw a flicker of understanding and then sorrow chasing it away in somebody's eyes. All right. Moving ahead. The look in his face just now included, unexpectedly, a hint of sadness. It was not the expression of a youthful man. Let's finally move away from the eyes. There came the sound of laughter then, laced with mockery, with something else in it that Thone could not quite identify. So now, from somebody's laugh, he is identifying not just amusement, but that this amusement is laced with mockery, and there's something else in that laughter that he couldn't quite identify from somebody laughing. And then we'll just wrap it up with this, back to eyes and looking at each other. "She had found herself meeting the clear blue gaze of the woman named Rosala. There was pain there, and something else, as hurtful, if harder to understand. But Lisot had taken resolution and a certain comfort from that exchange of glances, and tried as best she could to give back the same 2 things. So she's recognizing pain and something else kind of hurtful coming from her friend's glance, and she's trying to give back through her glance those 2 things, pain and something kind of hurtful. So, yes, I understand the author wants us as the reader to understand the subtle emotions that the characters are experiencing, but the way it is done through these incredibly detailed observations of the most subtle body language just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, and I really feel like there's a better way that the author could be presenting that. Now, I've always thought that the most cringy aspect of Guy Kay's writing is the way he writes sex scenes, and I have no problems with sex scenes in books. It's just like really any other aspect of storytelling. If it's done well, it can be a real great enhancement to a story. If it's not done well, it can just make it cringe so hard. And we're going to start off first by looking at how characters are sexually aroused in the book. And first, we have one of the female characters who is secretly tailing and following this other character. And he turns around and almost sees her, so she ducks into this alley, and all of a sudden she's in this alley with 2 strangers who are being physically intimate with each other, and they see her, and they give her this kind of subtle invitation to come in and join them as she's sort of hiding from this character she's trying to follow. And her response is, not really, Lisot said awkwardly, stirred against her will. She spun free of both of them. So in that crazy moment of being intently focused on this chase, this following this character. She finds herself aroused in this alley with two strangers. Another character at one point gets physically kidnapped, knocked unconscious, wakes up, tied up, and in this situation of being kidnapped and bound, he finds himself being aroused against his will. And I'm like, why? Now, the cringiest part of all is Gay's continuing insistence over the course of all the books I've read from him of calling the penis his sex. So instead of referring to it as his penis or something else, Kay, for some reason, always calls the guy's body parts his sex. And in that instance that I just mentioned, where the guy is kidnapped and knocked out and yet is sexually aroused by the whole situation, that's where we see an instance of this being used. So just to read that here briefly. His clothing and boots had been taken away. He was clad only in an undergarment that shielded his sex. He tried again without success to move his hands and realized with a kind of despair that what he was feeling, as much as fury and the several layers of pain, was the returning of desire, inexorable as the tides of the sea. I don't know why that particular wording causes me to cringe so hard, but every single time I read it in his books, it really does. So I don't know, maybe it's just a me thing. And then a final note on writing quibbles is there's one scene here that it's more of an editing thing, I think, that I don't know, I'm not quite sure why it's in the book, but basically chapter 11 starts out with the first 1/3 of the chapter is this very long and one-sided song competition where everybody's hanging out in a pub. One group of guys stands up and formally asks for a song challenge against the other nation that they're hanging out with in this pub. So that other nation has a guy stand up and says, okay, I will present my song for this challenge. He does so, and everybody is so overwhelmed with the incredible beauty of this song that the challenge is immediately over. The other side doesn't even get up and present their song. They're just so taken with this song. And unfortunately, the lyrics of that song are included in that passage, which really takes away from some of the magic of it, because you read the lyrics and you go, this is what everybody's getting all emotionally wrecked over? Really? And so it's a scene that doesn't make a great deal of sense. It really could have been taken out of the book and not taken anything away from the story, I don't think. But, just another example of something that could have been done a little bit better. Overall, like I said, I'm nitpicking. Guy Kay is a great writer. He can spin incredibly wonderful and deep stories. So, that's just a look at a few instances that I think could have been done a little bit better. Though I guess this next section is going to tie in a little bit to the writing too, but I like to look at the medieval combat that is done in these books. Like I said previously, this is largely historical fiction with a little bit of fantasy sprinkled in. But I have so many problems with the way the combat was done in these books. If they're trying to represent some kind of medieval historical setting, I just wish that they would at least make some attempt to represent the medieval combat in a somewhat realistic fashion. But what we get instead is almost a comic book feel to the way that the action takes place in this book. The first thing that struck me is the fact that so many characters are just bopped on the head to get knocked unconscious, and because the author doesn't want the character to be physically killed off, but they do need to be restrained and taken places or whatever else, so the characters just bop them on the head to knock them out. And it really feels so much like an old Tintin comic or one of these comics where characters just, instead of violently shooting and killing each other or whatever, they are just bopping each other on the head and rendering themselves conveniently unconscious. So we see, for example, fairly early on in the story, we have somebody taking their dagger and using the grip of the dagger to knock somebody out. This was done in this manner. That was all he managed to register. He had no chance for more, to move or cry out again, because Bertrand de Talaire's dagger haft rapped in a neat, hard, precisely judged blow against the back of his skull, and he lost all consciousness of moonlight or icons or pain. And this is done several times in the book to several different characters. which the author shows no understanding of physiology, and he makes it look like the easiest thing in the world to be able to deliver a blow to somebody's head in a way that will render them completely unconscious for a period of time, but not do any serious harm to them, which is much harder than you might realize. For one thing, it's not that easy to knock somebody unconscious, fully unconscious. And not only that, but all these characters have to be unconscious for an extended period of time in order for the events that are taking place here to happen. So they have to be really knocked comatose for, sometimes half an hour or longer, which is a terribly serious head injury. And for example, we see this, again, very early in the book. They've knocked a couple of people out in this instance, and they need to go off and do something else, but they're worried about leaving these characters alone. But we have this here. Blaze glanced down at the two tied up people in the boat. Both were unconscious and would likely be so for a while. How does he know? How can you tell by looking at an unconscious person that how long they're going to remain unconscious? Even with all the modern medical knowledge we have, myself as a paramedic of 16 years, I couldn't look at an unconscious person and go, they'll probably be unconscious for a while. How would you know that? And then finally, when these characters do regain consciousness after sustaining these terrible head injuries that have left them completely unconscious for a long period of time, more often than not, the characters wake up feeling a little dazed, a little woozy, but otherwise fine. They quickly get over it and they're back to business as normal. Unlike if you received that level of head injury where you're unconscious for a long time, you're going to have sustained, lasting, terrible concussion effects. And we have, thankfully, at least one character who has a sustained negative reaction to waking up after being knocked unconscious. But most of the rest of them wake up, they're like, don't feel a little off. Okay, I'm better, let's go. And it's all very strange how characters are constantly getting bopped in the head in this book. Next up, I won't go into it because this seems to show up in so many fantasy novels, but it's the old thing of people being held at bow point. So we got a bow being leveled at somebody and they're being threatened. And again, if you got a war bow, these are powerful bows that require a great deal of strength to draw. You're not going to be able to just hold it indefinitely in front of somebody to threaten them. A war bow is very much a pull, aim quickly, loose, and, holding somebody at bow point is taking a modern gun thing and trying to transplant it back into medieval times, which doesn't really work so great. There's also a couple of situations, speaking of arms and armor, where sword strokes are cutting cleanly through mail armor. So it doesn't specifically say mail armor. In the first instance, it says it went through the links of his armor, which would indicate mail armor. The second one, it says it cut straight down through the mesh. So again, it seems to indicate mail armor. Now, mail armor isn't the most effective armor for dealing with piercing blows, for things like very sharp things like arrows or stabbing with a dagger. You can definitely get through the rings of a mail coat with a piercing blow. One thing that mail is excellent at is blocking cutting blows. So there's no way, I don't think there's been a sword made in history that could cut nice and cleanly through mail armor. I don't think there's any sword that could cut through mail armor at all, in fact. It's just one of those things where that's really what mail armor is really effective at, is protecting from cutting blows. So the fact that swords just cut through mail like butter is kind of weird. I think my biggest complaint, though, is that all of the very big climax scenes where there is some kind of combat taking place, especially a 1-versus-1 combat between two key characters, every single time we have that, the scene is resolved in the most ludicrous superhero comic book style, where the weirdest thing happens that gets the character out of trouble. So we have one instance where we have two characters on foot fighting with swords and shields. The one character looks at the other character, realizes that character's shield is very polished and shiny, and because that character is very smart, he recognizes, this guy with shiny shield intends to get me into a position where the sun is behind me so that he can shine the sunlight off of his shiny shield into my face and blind me and then attack me and kill me. But I'm too smart for that. I recognize his plan with his shiny shield. So instead, here's my plan. And what he does is when they get close to each other, this guy bends down to the ground, grabs a handful of dirt, throws it at his shiny shield. Mind you, this is dirt. This is not mud. It hasn't been raining. This isn't sticky mud or anything. He just grabs a handful of dirt, throws it at the shield. The guy's like, oh no, he's discovered my plan with my shiny shield. And he bends down again, grabs another handful of dirt, throws it at the shiny shield, and somehow this dirt is sticking to the shield and taking away all the shine. And at the same time, he's close enough to throw dirt on the guy's shield, but the guy's not reacting. And the book describes him as being so shocked that his clever shiny shield plan was discovered that he froze and did not act while dirt was being thrown on his shield. So obviously if the guy is close enough to throw dirt on his shield, he's close enough to get stabbed in the neck. But the guy is just so shocked by having his clever plan discovered. And I'm like, medieval combat is so wild that a million realistic things could have been written into the story, but this is how you resolve it. There's another instance where a guy gets essentially ambushed by a bunch of archers, and he's on horseback, and first they shoot his horse out from under him. And as he's falling, he gets his feet out of the stirrups, grabs his bow. It says he's almost prone, like basically lying flat on his belly behind his dead horse for cover. And he takes out all the enemy archers. And again, they're so surprised that he's able to somehow, on his belly, draw and fire, grab an arrow, draw and fire, grab an arrow, draw and fire, before any of the enemy archers can even react and shoot him. Which I'd like to see anybody shoot a single arrow from their belly, let alone before any of the archer can react and shoot back at them. And so I'm like, well, this is taking me so far out of the story, this crazy comic book action, that I can't handle it for somebody who's into historical arms and armor like myself. It's just a little too much for me. But anyways, enough of my nitpicking. Let's talk about something I really liked a lot. And so we have war taking place. We have one nation invading another nation and doing the most horrible, awful things to that nation's women and children and civilians. And so naturally that causes a very violent response from the nation that's being invaded and having these things done to them. Two ladies are talking about this invading nation, and the nation they're invading has this great arch that was built by the ancients, this ancient civilization that existed long before the events of the story. And so one lady says to the other, will they build their own arch, do you think, if they destroy us all? And the other lady responds, a second arch, she said quietly, addressing the question asked. I wonder, do they build anything, these northerners? Of course they do. They are not inhuman. They are not really so different from us, Renette replied calmly. You know that. They are badly taught, that is all. There seems a great deal of difference to me, Lisseau said sharply, if they burn women alive and cut the heads and sexual parts off dead men. Badly taught, Renette repeated. Think of how much of the mystery and the power of life they have lost by denying our god Ryan. You'll forgive me, but I can't spare a great deal of time just now for pitying them that. I'm surprised you can. Renette gave a small, graceful shrug, looking out at the western shore and the arch beyond. We are trained to think that way. The times are evil, she said. Mortal men and women are what they have always been. 500 years from now, we will all be dust and forgotten, and our fates. But the gods Ryan and Coronos will steer the course of the world. And I think that's just a really great thing to keep in mind, especially as our world gets drawn into increasing conflicts and wars, and one versus the other, whether in our own nation or versus other nations. The act of war requires dehumanization, viewing the other person as less than human in order to be able to physically kill them and take their lives. We have to see them as being inhuman. But that's really what it comes down to, is we're taught differently. We have maybe slightly different worldviews, and every one of us is doing our best to live our life the best we can in this world, and we are all raised, and we're very much a product of our culture, our environment, the way that we're raised, how we're brought up really influences what we think and how we act, and ultimately, we're not that different from each other, although it is maybe easy to be able to dehumanize somebody who thinks differently from us or believes different things than us. Ultimately, the grand scope of things, to look at the wider perspective, we are all going to be dust and forgotten. All of us are going to be dead in a handful of years, and the next generation will carry on doing what they do, and the world will go on. So I think that's a great perspective, and I love that passage in particular. Now, to get down to the rating, like I said, Guy Kay writes a great story. He really does a great job at weaving together this rich history and background and pulling it all together into compelling events and an interesting story. But as you can see, there are just so many details within that story that irritated me, and so ultimately I think I am giving A Song for Arbonne a 6.5 out of 10. I was initially leaning maybe a little more towards 7, but the more I've thought about it in preparing this review, the more I thought, yeah, this isn't a book that I can see myself ever coming back to. In fact, I'm going to offload this particular book. I'll probably leave it in one of the local free lending libraries on someone's front lawn. And so it doesn't rank amongst the greats of Guy Kay, and unfortunately it ultimately ended up being a little bit disappointing, even though it was still an interesting story to read. And therefore, I am continuing my quest to find truly great fantasy fiction. If you have recommendations, please do put them in the comments below. I'd also just love to hear what you've been reading lately, regardless of genre. Are there any books you particularly loved? I would really like to hear about it. Please get into the comments. You know how much I love to hear from you, and in any case, I just appreciate you watching. Cheers. As well as some good fantasy books, but not that aren't particular. I just keep there's, and he can even write very well. Eloquent. Stumbling over the word eloquent. The character, most often than not, we see them feel they're not really so different.